Hello, my beautiful souls. Welcome to Spiritual Bloom, where we bloom within our consciousness, with your spiritual guide and twin flame coach Neha. In today's episode, we will be talking about the shadow side of being the divine feminine. So, if you've spent any time on self improvement, spiritual, or wellness side of the internet over the last few years, you have seen and noticed the aesthetic. Flowing silk dresses, warm, golden hour lighting, soft spoken voices telling you to stop hustling and telling you to surrender to the flow, to soften your receiving your energy and stepping into your divine feminine. Now that sounds intoxicating, doesn't it? In a world that feels aggressively fast, hyper-capitalist, and emotionally exhausting, the promise of the divine feminine feels like a sanctuary. It tells you that you don't have to fight anymore. You just have to be. But today, I want to talk about what happens when the sanctuary quietly becomes a golden cage. Because behind the pastel aesthetic, the romanticized stillness, and the spiritual jargon, there is a dark side to this movement. One that nobody talks about until you're already trapped inside it. Today we are diving deep into the shadow side of being the divine feminine. How a philosophy meant to empower women is quietly repackaging old patriarchy, weaponizing passivity, stripping women of their financial agency, and trapping hyper-aware, sensitive people in a cycle of isolation and self-doubt. Now let's start with the baseline doctrine of divine feminine trend, where the masculine penetrates, leads and builds, and the feminine receives, surrenders and nurtures. On a symbolic, archetypical level, sure, mythological frameworks have used these metaphors for millennia to help us reflect on human duality. But what happens when you take an abstract archetype and force it into a rigid, everyday rulebook for a real human life? You get spiritualized passivity. When you are repeatedly told that taking decisive action, pursuing dynamic ambition, or standing your ground is masculine or out of alignment, you begin to censor your own power. You start viewing your drive, your analytical boundaries, and your anger as evidence that you are wounded or healed incorrectly. I have seen so many brilliant, capable women tolerate absolute breadcrumbs in relationships, especially in twin flame dynamics, toxic workplace dynamics, or complete stagnation in their creative goals because they were waiting in their receiving era. But the hidden truth here is pure surrender without structure isn't divine. It's actually vulnerability without protection. When you refuse to use your masculine traits, for example, your logic, your discernment, your assertiveness, your structural boundary setting, you don't become a goddess. Instead, you become defenseless. You hand over the steering wheel of your life to anyone willing to grab it, naively hoping that they have good intentions. Now, Now, if you lean too far into the mainstream definition of divine feminine, you start noticing something deeply unsettling. It looks suspiciously like 1950s traditionalism dressed up in spiritual crystal wrap. It whispers to women that don't challenge his ideas, it turns off his masculine energy. Or it brings an idea that if a man isn't providing 100% financially, you are stuck in your hyper independent masculine trap. Or your main contribution is your softness, your youth, your aesthetic, and your ability to act as an emotional sanctuary for him. Now, did you notice what have happened here? We took centuries of restrictive gender roles, threw some sage on them, and called it high vibrational spiritual evolution. It teaches women to curate themselves for the male gaze all over again. Except this time, instead of pleasing a husband, you are trying to prove to universe or a prospective partner that you are soft enough, quiet enough, and surrendered enough to be chosen. It creates an intense, covert shame around financial independence, professional ambition, and direct communication. If you speak clearly and logically about what you want, you're labeled masculine. If you work hard for your own wealth, you're told you're living in fear. And that isn't spiritual liberation. That's regression with better lighting. We need to talk about something happening right now that most creators are terrified to bring up. The bizarre overlap between the divine feminine movement and the red pill or high value man dating culture. Have you noticed how these two opposing subcultures suddenly sound identical? On one side, you have aggressive male dating coaches telling men to pursue submissive young soft women. On the other hand, you have divine feminine coaches telling women to be receptive, submissive, and soft so a high value man will provide for them. They met in the middle, and the middle is financial dependency. This framework actively discourages women from building their own safety nets. It frames having a career or personal saving account as a fear-based living or distrusting the universe. It tells women to sacrifice their autonomy for the promise of being taken care of by a masculine. But here's the cold reality check. Financial dependency is not spiritual alignment, whereas spiritual alignment has always taught you to be independent, not just in the material world, but independent of your own emotions, of your own energy. So if you are being labeled by the term divine feminine, thinking that you can be financially dependent or energetically dependent on a masculine, it is not alignment. It is a vulnerability vector. When you do not have your own money, your own career, or your own tangible assets because you were told it was too masculine to build them, you lose your ultimate power of choice. You lose the power to leave toxic situations. You lose the ability to stand as an equal partner. True power is not being dependent on someone else's stability. It is having the capacity to build your own stability so that love is a choice and not a survival strategy. And this applies in this twin flame journey too, because at first you have been put through so much of darkness in your life so that you can stand your own ground, be independent of your own energy, independent of your own emotions, and finally, by utilizing that independent energy and independent emotions, investing into a material life, an independent material life. That is what this journey has always taught both the divine feminine and the divine masculine. But the dark side of the divine feminine nowadays is that they think that they have to be dependent on someone else, whereas the truth is that the universe never wanted you to be dependent on anybody for anything, not even for your emotions, not even for your healing. So how can you be so delusional about being a divine feminine and creating an image on your mind just because the internet is teaching some things that divine feminine has to be soft, divine feminine has to be this, and divine feminine has to be that? That is a wrong explanation of divine feminine. Divine feminine is power, but that power comes from the divine, and she stands her own grounds. She takes her own stand. She fights with the world, she fights with her own darkness, and achieves everything that she wants and is capable of in this lifetime. So, putting a tag of divine feminine and calling it that, that she's too dependent, if she has to be dependent on a masculine for material needs, for emotional needs, or if she's standing her ground, if she's focusing on her career, she's too masculine. Of course not. The twin flame journey has always taught you to balance your divine feminine and divine masculine energy for this reason. Since divine feminines are naturally soft-hearted, soft-spoken, they are naive at times. So, by healing, by being independent of their emotions and their energy, what happens is they activate the divine masculine energy, which is required to fulfill her dreams, to focus on her career, to take that decision about a business, to take that financial decision, to grow in her life materially. That divine masculine energy is required. That is very important. But she has to activate it. That doesn't mean a divine feminine will keep on waiting for a masculine to provide for her financially, emotionally. She is whole by herself. So now, this brings us to one of the most toxic dynamic traps in spiritual relationship, that is the emotional sinkhole. The popular narrative tells women that the divine feminine energy heals the room. It holds space. It takes the sharp, chaotic, or cold energy of a partner and softens it with unconditional love and soft presence. But that is wrong. In reality, this becomes a spiritualized excuse to tolerate toxic, unhealed, or emotionally unavailable partners. Because in this process, many divine feminines, they tell themselves that, if I just stay in my softness long enough, my high vibrational warmth will invite him into his healthy masculine, which is absolutely wrong. So in such situations, instead of walking away from an emotionally draining or disrespectful situation, or even being a third wheel in a relationship, you double down on emotional labor. You absorb his bad moods, excuse his lack of effort, and regulate his nervous system at the absolute expense of your own. You turn yourself into a spiritual rehab center for people who haven't even asked to change. And when the relationship inevitably fails or stays broken, the spiritual narrative turns inward on you, and you start questioning yourself and having self doubts. You think that maybe my feminine energy was not enough. Or you might even think that I brought too much anxious energy into the space. It becomes a self penetrating guilt machine where every failure of a relationship is blamed on your inability to just surrender harder. Let's talk about what this actually does to your body and your nervous system. In trauma psychology, we talk about the freeze and fawn responses. Fawn is pleasing others to stay safe, and freeze is playing dead when a situation feels overwhelming. What mainstream divine feminine culture often brands as surrender, stillness, or being in your flow is actually just a somatic freeze response. When a woman shuts down her boundaries, stops voicing her dissatisfaction, and detaches from her logic because she wants to remain soft, her nervous system isn't resting, it's numb. She is suppressing her natural self-defense instincts. Your body knows when you are compromising yourself. The knot in your stomach when you don't speak up, that's not low vibrational energy. That's your body begging you to set a boundary. That chronic exhaustion you feel after trying to be soft all day, that's the biological cost of suppressing your natural self-protective fight response. When you outlaw anger, logic, and self-assertion, you disconnect from your nervous system's built-in alarm system. You literally train your body to ignore danger in favor of maintaining an aesthetic state of calm. But that calmness doesn't come naturally. So where do we go from here? Do we burn down the idea of sacred energy entirely? No, we don't have to do that. But we have to grow up about it. We have to stop treating the masculine and feminine as a rigid, gendered binary that dictates how human beings should act every second of the day. You are not a static archetype. You are a complete dynamic human organism. A healthy, full realized woman is not just soft, receptive, and intuitive. She is also sharp, strategic, fiercely protective, and capable of taking massive, decisive actions. Your drive to build a business or career isn't a wounded masculine response, it's a human agency. Your sharp boundary isn't harsh energy, it's self-preservation. Your rage at injustice isn't low vibrational. It is that part of you that loves yourself enough to say that this is unacceptable. Nature doesn't operate in static softness. A mother bear protecting her cubs is pure feminine energy, but there is nothing soft or passive about her. She will tear down anything that threatens her structure. The ocean is feminine and it swallows ships whole. True spiritual maturity isn't about collapsing into one side of a polar duality. It's about integration. It's knowing how to rest into your flow when you are safe, and also knowing how to pick up the sword of logic, structure, and boundaries to guard your life when you are not. If you have been feeling exhausted by trying to be the perfect, soft, sun-drenched goddess, give yourself permission today to drop that act. I know you are going through a healing process. I know you are going through the ascension process. Already this twin flame feels so much burdensome. But be loud when something hurts. Work hard for things that you care about. Build your own bank account. Create your own security. Be soft when you are genuinely safe, and be sharp when you need to protect that safety. Don't trade your real, messy, powerful human agency for a trendy, spiritualized box. You don't need to be divine to be worthy, you just need to be whole. Divine is already within you. So, if this episode resonated with you, do like, share, subscribe, and comment. For any kind of personal guidance, you can WhatsApp or email me. My contact details have been given in the description box. Thank you for listening. Thank you for tuning in. I'll see you again in another episode.